Our lesson today is going to be taken from 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 1. We sometimes sing a song in our songbooks called "This World Is Not My Home." And that song emphasizes or reminds us of the fact that we have an eternal home in heaven that God has provided for us. Something that we have to look forward to that is better than anything that we could hope to have in this life. Well, that idea is found in our text in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 1, where Paul says in that passage, "For we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens." We have an eternal reward that is waiting for us. We have that home in heaven that God is providing for us. But it's easy for us, especially because we see the world that we live in now. We see where we are. We see what's going on. We get caught up in the distractions and the responsibilities and the joys of this life. And it's easy for us to forget that this world is not our home. And so in our lesson here today, I want us to contrast these two homes. Our temporary home here on the earth, and then our eternal home in heaven. But before we get to the contrast between those two, I want us to start out by asking this question: what is home? There are several ways that we can define home. We're going to be looking at basically four ideas about what makes home home. What is home? Well, number one, home is a place of comfort. David, in writing in Psalm 132, verse 3, in talking about how he wanted to build a house for the Lord, he said in Psalm 132:3, "Surely I will not enter my house nor lie on my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob." David is saying he was willing to sacrifice the comforts of home in order to focus on his task of finding a house for the Lord or building a house for the Lord. But the point behind that is that home is a place of comfort. Home is a place where we can enjoy ourselves and find rest. Home is also a place of security. If you remember back in Genesis chapter 19, when the angels came and visited Lot in Sodom and warned him that he and his family needed to leave the city because God was going to destroy the city because of the wickedness that was there. While they were there that night, the men of the city surrounded Lot's house and told Lot to send the men out that they might, quote, know them. And really what they were talking about there is they wanted to know them sexually. That's what they were focused on. That's what they were intent upon. And Lot went out to them, and Lot defended the men and made an appeal to these wicked men of Sodom that they've come under my roof, that there should be an expectation that they're safe there. Home is a place of security where when we are in our home, we have that expectation that we have safety, that we are secure there. Home is also a place of love. You have instructions in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25 for husbands to love their wives. In Titus 2 and verse 4, women are to be taught to love their husbands and to love their children. That this is what should be a characteristic of the home. The home is a place of love. Scriptures also show us that home is a place for family. There's a passage in the book of Proverbs, and the book of Proverbs is filled with all sorts of wise sayings that are easy for us to remember and easy for us to understand. And some of them are even a little bit humorous when you read them. And this is one of those passages in Proverbs 25 and verse 17. It says, Let your foot rarely be in your neighbor's house, or he will become weary of you and hate you. The wise man says there that it's possible that you can overstay your welcome. Even if someone is opening up their home to you, is welcoming you, you can overstay your welcome. You can abuse that kindness that your neighbor is showing you, or the tolerance that he has, where eventually he's going to resent you. He's not going to want you to be in his house. He's not going to want to see you. Why is that? Because home is for the family. We may open up our homes for friends or for neighbors or to show hospitality, and all of that is good. But the primary focus for the home is family. So these are the four things I want us to remember about home. Home is a place of comfort. It is a place of security. It is a place of love. And it's a place of family. Now, these four things are what we're going to contrast in this lesson. Make a contrast between our temporary home here on the earth and our eternal home in heaven. So let's start by talking about our temporary home, our home that we live here on the earth. What is this home like? Well, it is a place of comfort, but it is temporary, and it is imperfect comfort. The reason why it's temporary and because it's imperfect is because there is always work to do. There are always things that need to be done. Over in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verses 13 and 14, Paul said that the remedy for younger widows so that they don't become busybodies and they don't have so much time on their hands that they just are getting themselves into trouble. The remedy is to get married, keep the house, because that was just the work that is there in the home is enough to keep us busy. It's enough to keep us out of trouble. Over in Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 18, it talks about how that through indolence or through laziness, that the rafters sag, that the house goes into disrepair. Houses need to be maintained, otherwise they're not going to be the place of comfort that they have been. That you're going to have problems, things are going to start to fall apart, and it's going to be more work if we don't do the work of maintenance on the house. So the home is a place of comfort, but it's temporary and it's imperfect because there is work that needs to be done while we are here in this temporary and earthly home. Our temporary home here is a place of temporary and imperfect security. Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 24, he was talking about the day of the Lord that he was warning them about. In Matthew chapter 24 and verse 43, he says, "But be sure of this, that the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming." And he had just said that the day of the Lord is coming like a thief. And so he used that as an illustration because if the head of the house knew when the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would have not allowed his house to be broken into. Well, the reality is you don't know when the thief is coming. That was his point. You don't know when the day of the Lord is coming because it's just like the thief in the night. You don't know when the thief is coming. And so we might think of our home as a place of safety and a place of security. And generally speaking, it is. But you have dangers that still exist. You have the home that we have as a place of security. It's not one that is permanent. It's not one that is without any threat of danger or harm that comes to us. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19, Jesus said, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal." That, again, our homes are in danger of being broken into. Now, many of us live in parts of the country that we don't really have that as a pressing threat. Some places it is more likely that that could happen. But really anywhere we are, that's a possibility. That thieves break in and steal. Over in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 29, he said there, "Or how can anyone enter the strong man's house and carry off his property unless he first binds the strong man, and then he will plunder his house?" Now he's using this as an illustration, but again, it makes the point that you may even have people who would come in and would tie you up or somehow incapacitate you and do harm to you in order to take those things that you have in your home. So we have our home here. There's a place of security, but it is temporary and it is imperfect. Our home is a place of temporary and imperfect love. Those passages that we looked at there in Ephesians chapter 5 and Titus chapter 2, husbands are to love their wives and the women are to love their husbands and love their children. Why do those commands have to be given? Because sometimes we don't do that. Sometimes husbands don't love their wives as they should. Sometimes you have the women, the mothers, the wives, they don't love their husbands or love their children. You could say that, fathers, they might not love their children as they should. Sometimes that happens because all of us, every home, is made up of people who are imperfect. Romans 3:23 tells us we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So this home that we have here is a place of temporary and imperfect love. It's also, again, when we think about family, temporary and imperfect, because our family members, our loved ones, aren't going to be around forever. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27 says it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes the judgment. Everyone is going to pass from this life at some point. Unless we are alive when the Lord returns, we will all pass from this life. And our loved ones, that's going to happen to them too. And so the home that we have now, whether we're thinking about our spouse or our parents, sometimes even you have parents who lose their children. Tragically, that happens sometimes. But you have death that takes away those who are our family. And you have, again, Romans 3:23, that we are not perfect. And so we have this family that is temporary because of death, that death still exists. But it is also family that is imperfect because we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so there are a lot of blessings that we have in our homes here. But that's temporary. And it's inferior to what we're talking about with the eternal home in heaven. So as we make this contrast, we think about our earthly home here. What is our home in heaven that Paul talked about? He referenced in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 1. What is that home like? Well, it is a place of eternal and perfect comfort. Over in Revelation chapter 21, in describing this place, this reward that we are hoping to gain, this reward of heaven, they described here as the new heavens and the new earth. This is where we are in the presence of God. Revelation chapter 21 and verse 4, notice what it says about it here. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. All of the things that we have here that cause us pain, that cause us sorrow, that we mourn and we weep. We've talked about death. Those things happen. We could have things that are hardships that we have to face. Different things can happen in our lives that we are hurt by those that we love, whatever it might be. Those are real pains that we face here. But we're not going to have that in our eternal home. It is a place of eternal and perfect comfort, that God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There's going to be none of those things. The first things have passed away. Those things that caused us that hardship, those things that caused us to mourn and to cry and to sorrow, those things are going to be gone. Those things are not going to exist anymore. So our eternal home is a place of eternal and perfect comfort. It is a place of eternal and perfect security too. Again, in Revelation chapter 21, it says at the end of that chapter, verse 27, nothing unclean and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. Over in Revelation chapter 22 and verse 15, it says, outside are the dogs and sorcerers and immoral persons and the murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves and practices lying, those who would cause trouble, those who would influence us to sin. They're not going to be in that eternal home. They are outside of that home. They are not going to be in that home. They are outside of that home. And so this home in heaven is a place of eternal and perfect security. It's a place of eternal and perfect love because we will be in the presence of God. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 8 says, God is love. And so because God is love, we are going to be in His presence. We're going to be in the place of perfect love. A place where there is no inconsistency, where there is no failure, where there is no letting someone down. God is going to be there. God will not and cannot let us down. Over in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 6, Paul said there, and this is just a few verses after where we started, we read about this house that is torn down. We have an eternal home in heaven. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 6. Therefore, being always of good courage, and knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith and not by sight. We are of good courage, I say, and prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be at home with the Lord. This eternal home that Paul is talking about, he emphasizes here that we are going to be with the Lord. We are going to be with Him. And so we're going to be with the one who is love. We think about Jesus as the one who, in an act of love, died on the cross for us. Well, Paul wrote about in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17, that when the Lord returns, He's going to take those who are faithful. They're going to rise to meet Him in the air, and we will always be with the Lord. Always be with that one who willingly gave His life on the cross for us. It will be a place of eternal and perfect love, and eternal and perfect family as well. Again, our families here, we love our families, but our families are not perfect. And sometimes, as Christians, we have to deal with family members who don't agree with us about faith, about being Christians, who might oppose us or ridicule us for our faith. Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 10, Matthew chapter 10, that you have Jesus who had come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against his mother-in-law. Man's enemies will be members of his house. He said, I didn't come to bring peace but a sword. Now, He's not saying that He came to wreck people's homes and wreck people's relationships. His point was, when we follow Christ, there is the potential that others will not follow Christ. Those that we know will not follow Christ, even those that we are closest to. And so if we follow Christ, and then they won't follow Christ, they refuse to follow Christ, they think it's silly that you are following Christ, they think it's ridiculous that you are a disciple, that you're giving up all of these things to follow Him, that you're obeying His word, and so they oppose that, or they make fun of that, or whatever it might be, there's going to be division. Not because Jesus is trying to divide people, but simply because some people are not going to accept Him and will oppose those who do. Sometimes that's in our family. But in our eternal home in heaven, we don't have that. We have an eternal and a perfect family. John said over in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 1, See how great a love the Father has bestowed on us, that we would be called the children of God, and such we are. For this reason the world does not know us, because it did not know Him. We are the children of God. And so we have God as our Father. And we have Jesus over in Matthew chapter 12, when He was told that His mother and His brothers were outside where He was teaching. And He said, Who are my mother and my brothers? There at the end of Matthew chapter 12. He says, My mother and my brothers are those who hear the word of God and do it. They're not this physical family, but there's a spiritual family. That's the family that we have in heaven. And so in that eternal home, it's a place of eternal and perfect comfort, security, love, and family. And so what that means is that while we're here in this life on the earth, even living in our comfortable homes that we have here, we are pilgrims. We are outsiders, because our citizenship is in heaven. We need to remember that that is where our home is. That's what that passage in Philippians 3 and verse 20 says. Our citizenship is in heaven. And Peter said that because our citizenship is in heaven, we need to remember that and act a certain way. He said in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul. You are strangers and pilgrims. You are aliens in this world. And so don't follow after the lust of this world. Live in such a way instead that you will please the Lord, so you can reach that home in heaven. The very next verse in 1 Peter 2 and verse 12, Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles. So the thing which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. Keep your behavior excellent. Now that passage is emphasizing the example that we have before others, but this is also about being ready for when the Lord returns so we can be pleasing to Him. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10, again, the same context as where we began, talking about our eternal home compared to our temporary home here. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10 says, we will all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, and we're going to give an account for what we have done, whether it is good or bad. So we need to live in such a way as to reach that home. And while we are here, we need to use our time wisely. Paul talked about in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 and 16, we need to be careful how we walk. We need to use our time wisely. Make the most of your time because the days are evil. Are we doing what we ought to be doing to serve the Lord here? Are we making the most of our time? Wherever we are, in whatever situation we're in, we need to make sure that we are serving the Lord. Philippians chapter 1, verse 21, it says, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, that will mean fruitful labor for me, for I do not know which to choose. But I am hard pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. Yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. So Paul said here that there's two places that he's going to be. One is right now in this life, and one is with the Lord. And he says to be with the Lord is going to be so much better than what he has here. And the same should be true for all of us. If we're faithfully serving the Lord, then we could say the same thing, that it is better to depart and be with Christ. But Paul said while he was here, this was going to be fruitful labor to him. He was going to be busy serving the Lord and doing His will and trying to help as many people as he could. He was going to be doing those things. And so Paul said that to live on in the flesh, that's what his life was going to be like. He was going to use that time for good. And so we need to remember that while we might enjoy our lives here, while we might have comfort here, and we certainly enjoy the blessings from God here, this world is not our home. We need to remember that our citizenship is in heaven. As Paul said in Philippians 3 and verse 20, for our citizenship is in heaven, from which we eagerly wait for a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. We are looking forward to that home. And we need to make sure that we are serving God here so that we can look forward to it, so that we can have that expectation. And so while we live here, we can enjoy the blessings that God has given us. We can enjoy the comforts and the security and the love and the family that we have here. But remember that all of this is temporary and it is imperfect. But we have something that is eternal and perfect in every way waiting for us in heaven. So let's remember, this world is not our home. Let's be serving the Lord so we can reach that eternal reward in the end.